Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to Democracy Days. This is the panel discussion about critical race theory. My name is Martha Kampen, and I'm the Chief Diversity and Compliance Officer here at St. Charles Community College. It'll be my privilege to be the moderator of this distinguished panel. So I'd like to let you know that we're here to explore the academic concept of critical race theory, which is also referred to as CRT, to explain, clarify, define, share, and expand our understanding of CRT. So our distinguished panel, in no particular order here, is Dr. Gregory Bosworth. If you'd raise your hand, please, Dr. Greg, is our Dean of Humanities. Dr. Rachel McWhorter is a professor of English. Professor Marvin Tobias of Psychology. Professor Anastasia Bierman, English. And Professor Grace Moser, History. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.
Before we start with any specific questions, Dr. Bosworth, could you please share the goal of this panel and what we hope to accomplish through this discussion today?
Thank you, Martha. Originally, when Michael and I were talking to establish this and set this panel up, we were just talking, going over the specifics of things and what Democracy Day was, Democracy Days were, and how important they are to SCC. And we started a conversation, an email dialogue about this. And the original intent, to be honest, I wasn't supposed to be on this panel, but I wanted to hear from some of my colleagues and get their expertise in how they dealt with this issue. Being in Missouri, me coming from Texas, is a hot topic, it's a hot-bedded issue there, and it's very mainstreaming right now. And so the purpose of this is just to be informative and just to have an academic discourse with the audience and with community members and faculty members to share some light, reveal, debunk, and maybe give some clarity or understanding of what we are here to do when it comes to an academic discipline, when it comes to teaching race and talking about critical race theory. So that was the purpose of this panel right here. So I'm just thrilled to have my colleagues agree to this, looking at their backgrounds and looking at their ideologies on how they teach and where they're going with their research. I think it was just an appropriate panel to have at SCC at such a pivotal time in our country's history and at such a pivotal time of growth and innovation and change at SCC. So I'm looking forward to seeing what this panel divulges, uncovers, unearths, and brings to light. So I look forward to hearing your commentary. I look forward to hearing the commentary of my colleagues, and I'm just excited about what we're going to do here today. So anyone else want to add anything to that?
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Bosworth. To assure that we all have a clear understanding of this topic, would the panel please define what critical race theory is and what it's not? And why is it called critical race theory? Whoever would like to take that question.
Is this examining like the history of it, maybe? Or is that a later question? I didn't want to jump the gun on that.
It's just we're setting the foundation right now so that we all have the same understanding of what CRT is and what it's not.
So critical race theory is basically just the idea. It's hard for me, I'm sorry, I'm a history teacher and my name is Grace Moser. It's hard for me to talk about a topic without pulling in all the history and providing a context for it. I think that it really helps in this case, but it's basically just looking at the United States with the lens, particularly at racism in the United States, looking at it through the lens that racism isn't exactly, or it can't be resolved through legislation, or it's not easily resolved through legislation, and that it goes back to looking at the history of the United States as one in which racism has been systemic. So it's not about individual actions of racism, it's taking a view at this idea that racial practices were ingrained in the political systems, the legal systems, the judicial systems of America, and that has long-term consequences, which we see happening today. And if I may, this comes out of the civil rights movement. With the civil rights movement, there was significant legislation passed to address racism. And then in the 80s, scholars and activists sort of looked around and they didn't see much changing as a result of that legislation. In fact, there was even fiercer resistance at times to those laws, and segregation still continued, even though not legally, and there was still inequality in education that existed, and so scholars looked for some explanation, legal scholars looked for some explanation into this, and that's where the critical race theory really came from, this idea that it is ingrained in society. What it is not, what it's not is it's become a hot topic issue that gets people up in arms. This idea that we're teaching that white America is evil and that they just wanted to hurt black people all the time. That's not really what it's saying. It's just looking at the reasons why racism is still such an issue and racial division is still just an issue. It's not something that's easily resolved with just passing legislation that calls for equality. It's much deeper than that. So that's my take on it. I don't know if anybody else wants to take a stab.
I'd be happy to jump in and extend this into literature, because I'm an English professor. I'm Rachel. And thank you, Grace, for that. That foundation is, we use critical race theory in literature. We don't really talk about it until I think I heard about it first as an undergrad. We'll talk later about what it means to potentially extend this more overtly to younger ages in schooling. But it's absolutely that. It's more of a lens than a content itself. It is a way of seeing racism as it is a very integral fabric in what makes this nation cross-cultural discussions. And in literature, we really value the story, right? That always warms my English teacher's heart to look to, are we getting stories on this? Who's telling the story? From a historical standpoint, we always talk about, right, history being told by the victor. What stories have we lost? Who's at the margins? All these kinds of languages that critical race theory, when borrowed from the legal field by something like literature, has really investigated and worked to add these diverse voices and lived experiences. I do think it's an interesting moment that we see this, that's been around 40 years and not highly controversial. I was excited initially to hear that people were talking about it, but the context in which it's being discussed is a little misguided, I think, and perhaps with some clarity can be helped. I think that once we've seen this most recent wave of Black Lives Matter, right, in the past year or so, and we have seen companies want to claim an anti-racist stance, we've seen texts like white fragility and how to be an anti-racist top the charts. People, particularly I think mainstream white audiences, as it ought to be, reading and investing in this in a new way. I feel like this is perhaps a pushback, a recognition that the power of text and stories and the way we frame our American narrative is powerful. So there is going to be fear and concern whenever there is change or growth. There is discomfort, and I think that's what we're seeing here. Not to understate it, more than discomfort perhaps, but that's really my thought. I was coming to this as an English teacher. If anyone else wanted to add more to that.
Rachel, I'm wondering if either you or Annie might want to talk about why it's called critical race theory. I think we had a little bit of discussion about the word critical.
Yeah.
So, of course, thinking about anything with the word critical, kind of taking it back to what is a critic, right? So a critic is someone who, terrible things for an English teacher to do is use a definition or use a word in the definition, to critique, to examine, to expand on, to really kind of see the whole, take it and investigate, right? So you critique it in a way. So I always think about a food critic, right? So they go to a restaurant and they're trying out a food. They're trying to decide, do I like this, the way this chicken was prepared, right? Compared to other chicken that you've had. And you kind of look at it as a whole experience, right? So if you think about critical race theory, the theory is also the very important word as well. It's a theory. It's not it's an academic discussion, But I think a lot of the issue here with critical race theory is that it's being conflated and misinterpreted for culturally relevant teaching, which is also a CRT. But teaching so let's say we have a diverse classroom. I have maybe 20 students in my classroom. You have maybe 10 white students and 10 that are non-white. So would it be fair for me to teach just kind of a white curriculum to those 10? I have 10 students, and so I'm alienating 10 other students. Not necessarily saying that we shouldn't be teaching kind of the entire history, but there's so much that we could teach, and there's so much that have been forgotten, the forgotten stories, or people's voices that have not been appreciated by the larger canon. And so I see culturally relevant teaching bringing in stories that may have existed for a long time, but you only get in those obscure, maybe graduate classes, but you don't get them in. How many of you in high school read The Great Gatsby? Okay. How many of you read, in maybe any of your education, Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn? Did you read Toni Morrison? It's a little hard for high school. I think of Zora Neale Hurston. You have Margaret Atwood. And you've read Shakespeare, I'm sure. Charles Dickens. You may not have liked it as much as, some of us do. But you have these voices. So who gets to determine, obviously your school districts, but these are great literature, right? And who gets to decide what's great? And so it's kind of that culturally relevant teaching is really trying to look at the entire United States. And looking at the makeup of our campus, right? And looking at makeup of our United States and thinking about including everyone's voices or seeing someone that looks like you in a piece of literature, a story that you're reading. Seeing someone that looks at you, for me, Shang-Chi, right? The Marvel movie that just came out. Seeing Asian people on a Marvel, big screen blockbuster was huge for me. Didn't really see that besides Mulan as a child. And then a couple years ago, Crazy Rich Asians. Representation matters, and culturally relevant teaching helps to do that. And I think that that's something that's been very confused, critical race theory and culturally relevant teaching.
I agree absolutely on that, Annie. I thought that was a really good point because CRT is the acronym for both of them, right?
Yeah.
And I do think that culturally relevant teaching has been conflated with critical race theory. At least in the pushback that's going on in K through 12 schools that's happening right now. No third grade teacher is teaching critical race theory about systemic racism and look at these laws from this particular year, right? They're trying to include stories about African American authors and African American inventors. If learning is about the real, true learning happens when you are able to relate to the material, that it's meaningful to you. Culturally relevant material is looking at everyone else in your classroom and saying, your story is important, your story is American history as well. We are going to include that. And that is what engages students and makes education more than just rote memorization and memorizing facts, and makes it something that's meaningful. And I think it's something that we would all want as educators. Those of us up here are educators. That's what we want, the experience we want to create in our classrooms. And as a parent, that's the experience that I want for my kids in school.
Thank you for that. I think we've pretty much covered the origins and the historical path of CRT, so I would like to ask about some of the myths that are associated with critical race theory and how we might be able to debunk some of these myths. Who would like to take that question?
I'll go on this one. There are a lot of different ideas and myths about CRT, and I'm actually going to try and go more, I don't want to say I'm in the middle, but I'm going to go and identify some myths that you can see based on political affiliation on multiple sides for CRT. Because ultimately I think that the focus, whether it's CRT or anything, is advancement of every particular person in society, regardless of how they might identify themselves. So one myth that I hear of someone who might be ideologically on the left is that CRT is just teaching the right history. But historically, CRT wasn't really focused on teaching history. It was focused on using a particular lens, which Grace said, using a particular lens to explain specific institutions. So it's not teaching right history, it's teaching history from another perspective, which you want to have diverse voices, because we know from the psychological area that children identify race in the first 6 months of life, and they identify racial categorizations by 4 years. So they need to have some type of diverse literature there. So when someone's like, critical race is just teaching the real history, it's not teaching the real history, it's teaching a history from another particular perspective, from voices that have not always been heard. On the right side, you might hear someone say, critical race theory, it's teaching people to hate America, it's a Marxist ideology. It's trying to destroy America. There is truth to the idea that in critical race theory history, there is an advocacy component. It's mentioned in their writings. There is an advocacy component of critical race theory. They want people to be an activist towards it. But as the historians can support me, well, as they could actually tell you, when a movement comes out that seems to suggest question-specific ideals about America, it historically is labeled as something as anti-American. And so critical race theorists, they say outright in their writings, they want to question the liberal traditions of America. And it's a plethora of individuals that classify themselves as CRT. Simply questioning liberal tradition in America isn't a problem. It isn't anti-American to question it. That's not anti-American. Sometimes certain labels are used to create an emotional response to things, which again is it's historically what happens. And so when labels are applied, it causes an emotional reaction, it gets the temperature up, and sometimes we have to bring the temperature down. CRT, this one here, okay. The CRT in K through 12, which is actually another question, there's an idea, so CRT is in K through 12, it's in our classrooms, and the immediate response is no one's teaching it. As you said, there's no third grade teacher teaching the legal structure and makeup of why we have CRT. And this is where it gets tricky, just being honest, because in the history of CRT, there is an education piece by the name of, her name is Dr. Gadsden Billings, who actually wrote a paper that indicates what is CRT and what's it doing in our good field of education. This is not applying CRT to education. What it says is, let's take some of the ideas and look at education, because the context that she was using was still early 80s and 90s. And so she was seeing in the classroom she was dealing with minoritized students that she felt weren't getting a voice. Because she's a teacher of education, she did teach teachers, but what happened is the teachers that she influenced, they don't go into the classroom and then say, America's horrible and bad. They simply say, minoritized students, you have a voice. Let's get your voice. Let's help you achieve. A myth. CRT promotes dumbing down of the curriculum. That is anti-CRT. Again, in the piece that Dr. Billings wrote, she literally says the curriculum treats African Americans as deficient. They are not deficient. They should be in the challenging classrooms. So when someone says classroom structure has changed, it's trying to dumb down students, that is actually anti what individuals who endorse CRT are actually, it's against the original principles of CRT. Another myth that you might hear, equity is CRT, microaggressions are CRT, systemic racism is CRT, minoritized students are CRT, marginalization is CRT. What CRT did is they borrowed terms that other fields were using because the context in which it was created was again focusing on minoritized voice, and specifically they were focused on black students or black individuals at the time. So you'll hear common themes. So for example, in psychology, there's theories about ambivalent racism, aversive racism. That was out in the early 70s. There's no connection to CRT. We were already using the terms. Kimberly Crenshaw is identified as using the term of intersectionality, which is the combination of multiple identities. Psychology was doing research on identities since the 60s. Now, what she is credited for is forming up a piece how these multiple identities that people have intersect and how they respond to the world. But Psych's been doing them. I hate to like reclaiming it now. Sorry. Psych's been doing it. We've talked about identity and saliency of an identity in a particular context. That's the research that we do. And we know that it's important to understand it. So there are these myths, but I think it's just, at some point, we have to turn the temperature down of taking sides to a situation. You stop using the terminology, the words to incite, to say like, okay, if somebody's African American in America, what does that individual need or do to succeed at something? Do they need something different? Do they need something the same? It's not a situation that the only way that we can exist in a particular society is by removing that identity in the first place. And that's my big issue, is the way that CRT has been presented and come out and been politicized. It actually is reversing America, not because people are now focusing on race, but we're having legislation basically saying that as an African American, I can't choose my identity. I have to only choose to be color aversive or color blind. But for society to advance, it has to be acceptable for me to say my particular identity and someone else not to have a problem with me having that identity. But we're literally legislating that out, and that's a problem. That's all I have.
Thank you, Dr.
Could I
Tobias.
actually add
Yes,
one
please.
thing to that? That's
Yes,
okay. I was
please do.
thinking of another myth. I think this idea, as we mentioned, historically, we see CRT emerge post-civil rights movement, late 70s, 80s. Alongside this, I imagined in some case well-intentioned, but a fairly hopelessly naive notion of colorblindness, which we still work against to this day. And I think there's this concern that CRT will bring out greater hate, greater pain, like it will be against, if the idea, sort of, I hate to do a pro-con, but a pro-CRT is, this will have us talking more honestly about our racist past. The pushback is this fear, but isn't that just going to be more divisive? Isn't that just going to be more fodder for this conflict that we have been having in different forms since the beginning of this country and before? But I think, I think that we're at risk there of ignoring trauma. The importance of dealing with trauma, and I'm definitely not a psych person, so you're free to jump in on this, but my understanding would be, again, going to the power of story, like to name something is a first step in owning it and getting your hands around it and trying to deal and work through it. And what we need is healing in very different rate based off your regional, your racist, by your background. And I think we just came off a very big national anniversary, right? We talked about a trauma, the hashtag never forget, and I could talk about the context of that. There are some interesting things there, but saving that for another time, we clearly as a nation honor this notion of a recognition of trauma and loss. I would venture that this is another instance that we need that, right? And I can think of an example if this might help. So back in the day as a graduate student, I was at the University of Alabama, that's my home state, Roll Tide, and I taught women's studies there, which, you know, you can imagine that might be an interesting, I had a class of all football players one summer, I'm not kidding. But an example I have is as students would walk around campus, we could get into so many things reading a campus as a narrative, but they would go by the biology building, I believe it was, who is unfortunately named after eugenicist, but that's also another story for another day. There are graves there. There are graves on the side in the grass, unmarked graves. Now this was back, date myself, gosh, over 10 years ago, going on 15. There have been changes to this, but I had students ask, like, wait, there are graves on this campus. These were unmarked child slaves' graves. The campus of University of Alabama was built by enslaved people's labor. The building I taught in was one of the oldest corners. It was nationally registered historically, was not razed during the Civil War. So we were working in classrooms that were made possible by the enforced labor of Black people that had walked on that soil. That was a powerful thing to talk to my students about, and it still gets me now. That's the trauma. That's the thing that we need to address, that CRT offers a lens, a way into that, the power of stories. So, and since then, the SGA has taken measures to look into the past, look into a fire that happened, who might be the names. Usually there's just a first name, right, of these children, and there's a plaque. But some way to provide, to humanize all individuals that participate in this history. I just think that's part of it. It's this resistance that we might have to the trauma and to the painful stories. But if we're going to heal, we ultimately have to name it and face it. So just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel.
I'm going to jump in there for a second, Martha.
Please.
I would like to just second what Marvin said and what Rachel said. I won't reiterate all of those things there, but we do have a responsibility, and that's the purpose of this right here. We are at a higher education institution, and what I mean by higher, I don't mean lower, I mean higher. We have higher standards here for all of our students, and we have all of our standards, have higher standards for all of our faculty members here as well too. And just being able to see students how they were coming to us from high school, not knowing certain things that quite frankly should have been introduced to them at an earlier stage of development, educational development, and getting them to a point now where they feel almost betrayed or lied to in some regards. And it's like we're reforming those students, but sometimes in some cases it's kind of late, guys. And because right now when they need that cultural identity developed or that cultural identity expanded upon, they're not getting that because of, as Marvin said, it's being legislated out of the classroom. And I'm not sitting here saying pro or against, that's not my argument. But my point is, as an academician, all of us sitting up here, we have a responsibility to make sure that we tell the complete story. We always use a word that we spin around that sounds good to say, and you asked what I'm about to say, it's holistic, right? What does holistic mean, right? What does it mean? Just everything. And so when we do that, when we cut out certain pieces, just imagine baking a cake without eggs or milk or flour. Will that be a complete cake? Will it rise to the top? Will it taste good? I mean, no, it won't. I mean, not from the standards that we're used to tasting cakes. And so as academicians, we have to debunk myths. We have to expand on narratives. We have to be able to create these critical dialogues that are important to what we're trying to do here, because what we're trying to do is not sway, not convince, but we're trying to inform. That's what we're trying to do. That's the purpose of education, is to inform and to educate. And you can make your own decision on how you stand, but it's up to us to present you with the information, and that's the purpose of debunking myths or expanding upon narratives or just clarifying some points of views and things of that nature. I had the privilege of meeting Dr. James Lowen before he died years ago. He came to Howard University when I was studying to get my PhD, and there's a book he wrote, and I don't know if many of you guys heard this, Lies My Teacher Told Me, by James Lowen. By show of hands, who's heard of that? Raise your hand if you. Okay, all right. So, right here, if you guys want to see that. So it was a powerful book. And if you read the book, you'll understand what he's trying to say, that was it intentional? Was it purpose-driven? Or was it lack of information that they didn't know themselves? And so all those things are thrown into the book. And as I understand it from being a historian myself, as of Grace by historical trade, that's what I am. Before I'm an administrator, I'm a historian, and I do like the story. As Rachel said, I want to hear the story. It's my responsibility to tell the story the way it is. Sometimes the story, guys, isn't pretty. Sometimes the story has a bad ending. Sometimes the story can be melancholy. It can be happy. But we have a responsibility to tell all parts of the story, and I think that's the purpose of what we're trying to do here today. And by debunking things, by understanding and expanding upon certain stereotypes, certain ideologies that, you know, that go into CRT and culturally responsive teaching, and that's what we want to do and continue to do, and have these critical conversations on discourse at this institution. So if anyone else wants to add anything, I'm open to that.
I actually got to hear James Lowen speak when I was in graduate school. It was really awesome.
Yeah.
He was doing research on his Sundown Towns book. So I just wanted to speak real quick to the idea of critical, because it kind of goes along with like what we were talking about with myths, and then like what the critical part of critical race theory means. So critical is, to be critical of something is to ask questions, and that is where, if you go back to like ancient learning, that was like Socrates' method of learning, was to ask questions and to understand that. And I don't think critical, like Annie and Rachel were saying, critical doesn't mean that it's bad, right? It's not passing judgment on something, although that can be something that your students want to do after you hear something really terrible that happened in history. It's more just about questioning whether or not what you've heard or what you've known, whether that is true, whether that is what you want to be representative of you. And I was just going to say that inclusion of other perspectives helps to create empathy. And empathy is one, like, I hate the term soft skill, but that's something that is a soft skill that job places identify as being necessary and that college students are not getting. History and taking a critical race theory approach exposes and tells different perspectives and teaches empathy. Empathy can be learned. It's not simply just putting yourself in someone else's shoes, right? If I became I can't just ask myself, Grace, what would it feel like to be a Native American on the Trail of Tears? How do you think you would feel? My own experience, my own background, my growing up as a suburban white kid in Ferguson, like that, there's no way I could fully understand what it's like to be a Native American in the 1830s. But if I really do a deep dive and look at cultural experiences that a person in that time period would have, and look and see how that person was shaped and what they believed, and look at their belief system, what the impact of removing a Native American from the territory that they lived in, that their religion, that their identity, that their ancestors were based on. That's taking it not from my perspective of what would I do in that situation. It's really putting yourself in the time and place and feeling, really connecting to that person. And that is a really powerful experience, and it helps you to create empathy. And I don't know about you guys, but I feel like empathy is like a thing that is severely lacking in our culture. Like, if I could change one thing about America, I think I would, there's a lot I would change. But that is one thing that I would change, like, immediately. Like, and empathy is so important, just to be, I don't know, respectful and kind and empathetic to what other people are facing. Like, I feel like it would make living in this world in the 21st century a lot easier if we had it. So I just wanted to emphasize that this is a lens, it is a perspective, it's critical thinking, it's asking questions, and it's taking that perspective and viewing something that is maybe not your own experience, but giving it value. I really liked what Rachel was saying about trauma. I've experienced traumatic events in my life. I don't know if you guys noticed, there's a dog up on stage with me. I have PTSD as a result of a trauma that I experienced in my life. We don't have to talk about what that was, but my therapy for it was to go back and experience it and to acknowledge it and just allow myself to feel it. And acknowledgement is huge in recovery. And if you are talking about intergenerational trauma, which is what do we get into in history, you can see that acknowledgement is key to actually recovering from it. And I will just mention, like, I think it's a little bit strange that the United States is having this debate. I think it comes from American exceptionalism, this idea that America was the exception to every rule, like we're the best type of mentality. I think that is kind of a crutch that I think education sometimes falls on, that we can't ever criticize anything that the United States did. We're the best. You know what? Women don't have freedom in the United States? Psh, just go look at Saudi Arabia. Okay, but how about France? France has like a lot more equality in the books. Like, why does it automatically have to be Saudi Arabia? I digress. When you look at how other countries have dealt with this difficult history, they don't hide it. They talk about it. They acknowledge it. Case in point, Germany and the Holocaust. It's a mandatory curriculum that all of their students learn about the Holocaust, learn about all of the terrible things that happened. They acknowledge it. They have a national day of mourning. They have so much more acknowledgement of the really, truly terrible thing that happened there. Yet, if you look at Australia, there's been a public apology for the stolen generation of Aboriginal children that were taken away from their families. The same programs happen in the United States, where children were taken away from their parents in forced adoptions or were put in boarding schools.
Still going on now.
Yeah. I mean, like, there's in the news right now all these stories about mass graves being discovered at those boarding schools of these Native American children who were killed, and it was covered up. So acknowledgement is key if you want to. I mean, like, to me, it's key to understanding where we are in the present. If you want to understand the present, if you want to know why the hell so many people got into the streets with George Floyd, you have to acknowledge the history, the real history. And I will tell you, when Greg said that students are angry, I will tell you, I see that anger for lied to my entire K through 12 education. I never learned about slavery. I never learned about any of these things. Oh my God, Columbus did what?
Yeah.
And it's like, you know, we have a discussion and like, well, you know, you can take a couple things away from this. You can walk away and be cynical and think that everybody lied to you. Or you can think critically, like, why do you think they taught you that story? What was the fear? Like, what were they afraid of? Like, do you think that you would hate the United States for, like, knowing this? And full disclosure, some of my students do think I hate the United States. They write it on my Rate My Professor. If you ever want to have fun, go read my Rate My Professor page. My favorite comment is, Grace hates America, but she has a solid monopoly strategy. And it's true, I do. So if you want to know that monopoly strategy, come see me after this panel. But it's different, right? It's not talking about the bad things isn't hating. It's just getting a more complete story to understand how we got to where we are today. That's just what I wanted to say about critical thinking. I don't know if that's relevant to what we were discussing.
Yeah, I think it is. And just to add to your point before we go on to the next point, Martha, just to quote something, and I'm going to scramble this quote up because I don't know it exactly, but Frederick Douglass said, Grace, and you know, to be a true patriot is one to question, you know, to criticize the country critically. And that doesn't mean you dislike America or hate America, but Frederick Douglass, himself a staunch patriot, advocate for abolitionism, he said you have to be able to criticize in critical moments when this country is doing something wrong and be able to look at it in the mirror and still love it at the same time. There's a love and hate relationship for America, for people of color who've been so oppressed by this country. We cannot ignore it, as Grace said. As someone who is a historian and a person of color, it's almost that I see the hypocrisy. I see the hypocrisy in what Rachel just said. Hey, let's remember 9/11. No, don't talk about slavery. But we can remember what happened to certain groups of Japanese or Japanese in the internment camp. No, don't talk about the kids that are still missing from Katrina. We don't talk about those things, but we have a responsibility, and I keep going back to that word because we as higher educational professionals and academicians, we have a responsibility It's not to race bait. It's not to saber rattle. It's to talk about the truth. And sometimes the truth is not that popular, guys. Sometimes the truth, it gets strange looks like I may have gotten a few earlier today, but that's okay. We're still going to talk about it. We're still going to be able to have discourse about it because I may not see it from your perspective. You may not see it from my perspective, but that's why we have an intellectual discourse so we can come to some sort of medium and resolve this in an amicable way that's educational for all parties involved.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone. Grace, I'm wondering if you could pick up, and we've done a really good job, thank you panelists, in talking about the importance of having this discussion in higher education and our responsibility as higher education educators. I would like to hear the student side of it. So how has this affected, by teaching CRT or bringing in the full story, as some of you have said, in the history lesson, in the literature lesson, how, the psychology class, how has that affected our students and how do they respond? And of all, positives, negatives, we've heard some of your negatives, that's okay, Grace. But some of, just what are some of the positive responses first from the students?
Well, I have ones that I have two that just happened in the past semester, or the past academic year. Like, yes, there are the negative ones, the people who get mad at me, who think that I hate America and I'm teaching them to hate America. But I had one student in fall of 2020 who told me that she didn't sign up for African American history class because she was afraid to take the class from a white teacher because she was afraid that I would misrepresent things. She didn't know that I was the teacher, and she ended up taking me for History 102, where I include a lot of African American history, because to me it's just American history. I don't fully understand the need to separate it out, but I think it's necessary because it is excluded so often from curriculum. And when she realized that I was someone that was open to that perspective and I wanted to be inclusive, we had this amazing collaboration the entire semester where she was sending me deeper dives into history that she was doing. She said, I really liked how you included this, but have you looked at this? And it was a really memorable experience for me as an instructor. There were so many benefits to me to be able to see a student just really engaged and looking at that material in such a deeper way. And then I had another experience this past spring when I taught, no, it was over the summer, I'm sorry. I have a lot of visiting students from other colleges that come home for the summer and take classes with me. So I had a student that I had been in close contact with who was a student, I think, at Mizzou. And he thanked me at the end of class, and I had an assignment where I asked them to consider the case for reparations towards slavery in America, because I teach through a lot of current issues, and I want them to connect to the present, what the things that they're learning about in the past. And so in light of everything that we had learned in the semester, what did they think about whether or not the case for reparations was valid or not? And he contacted me, and he did the assignment, no problem. He contacted me and said, Grace, I just want you to know that I really learned something in this exercise, which is that I came into the assignment thinking that I knew, and he was a white student, thinking that I knew what was going on with reparations, that it was a dumb idea, that there was no case for it. Why should we have to pay for something that happened 150 years ago? But then I sat in this class and I listened to the experience of African Americans, and while I don't know if I agree that reparations should be paid, I understand that perspective, and that is really powerful. From here on out, I'm going to take that perspective every time I get something that I'm not sure of. I'm going to stop and think and get all the viewpoints before I make my decision. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. That is a breakthrough. That was I filed that away in my Grace, You're a Good Teacher file to read whenever I get the Grace, You're a Terrible Teacher comments. I can go back and read that. Because that was such a positive thing. He had never been exposed to that perspective, and he was able to have that transformation that he could walk away and say, I now know, I'm empowered to look into this for myself and make my own decision. based on fact, not based on feeling, but doing the research myself and coming to my own conclusion. And so that I thought was a really powerful and positive effect of teaching in this way.
I love that. That is the college experience, isn't it? That's supposed to be the college experience, is where we bring the information to our students and help them guide and determine their own perspectives. Who else would like to address that? About the students.
I'd be happy to. I just this past year, with everyone being, online and remote, quite more than usual, I've been teaching a lot of English 101 online, which overtly, we're learning how to write things. But I very deliberately, without maybe always disclosing initially my intent, I have essay. We read Frederick Douglass and Malcolm X's Stories of Literacy right off the bat. I had I think 3 students just from this past summer and spring semester alone write me and specifically say, I noticed that, and these were students of color, I noticed that you had writers of color, and I appreciate that. Or this is the first time I've read more, writings by people of color than white writers in a class. And I don't say that as any big deal to me. In fact, it was a little surprising because you realize what that means, right? As a white woman, this isn't something I would have experienced much myself, but having text assigned that in fact gave voice to someone, again, that looked more like you, that represented a position in society or cultural history, different from that mainstream white view that we've so often gone to in the canon. I think, too, it's a great gateway, introducing these views and showing students this is, I jotted down a few names thinking if, like a LeVar Burton moment, you don't have to take my word for it, there are more awesome text and theoretical fields that connect to this, additionally, like Latino crit theory, queer theory, crip theory, which is critical disability theory, these terms that have been reclaimed. They're distinctly their own, to be sure, but they build on the same tradition of questioning one universal truth or story that's meant to explain everyone's existence, and instead puncture that, right? Complicate that, bring more diverse views to the table. So again, if you're getting interest sparked here or curious, there are a lot of other awesome avenues to go with this, to challenge, to look for voices other than perhaps the one we're used to hearing, and maybe someone who looks, speaks, or comes from an experience that matches more up with your own.
Anybody else want to explore any further the importance of... Thank you, Greg.
I do agree with what Grace said, and I just seeing that light bulb go off in students once they realize that maybe they were looking at it from a different perspective and understanding what it means to look at things intensively and critically. It's ultra important to a student's overall development, not just in a history class or an English class, but to their overall success in college and into our life, because you have to look at things critically. I taught a class this spring before I came to SCC, and I taught a class called the Antebellum South, and it was a 300-level class. Of course, it was a 4-year institution before I came here, and I used this text right here, The Peculiar Institution by Kenneth Stamp, and I brought that here today. I've been using this book for a while. You see, it's kind of raggedy, so I've been in it for a minute. So, but it's about slavery in the antebellum South, and I had a wide array of students in that class, from transfer students to students who were taking classes at University of Texas at Tyler. They were cross-registered, and I had some white students in the class, and we did a deep dive into what is slavery, and as Marvin did, debunk the myths of CRT. You almost have to debunk some of the myths of slavery, and so just seeing that, being able to debunk those things and being able to see the expressions, to be able to see the light bulb goes off, to see the transformation or transmogrification in front of you, it's mind-boggling. To tell students that, sure, we had absentee slave owners, So what, Dr. Bosworth? Absentee slave owners? Yes, you did. You had slaves who were craftsmen, artisans, who would make enough money to buy their freedom and their family's freedom. You know, you had slaves that had a time clock that would come in and go out. You had slaves that were able to read. You had slaves who were able to marry. You had slaves who would be off on the weekend. You had slaves people who were enslaved who didn't work all day. You had slaves who just only cooked. There's so many things about this that you have to impress upon your student, and when you see that light bulb go off and you try to break it down to them, and they say, wow, I did not know this, and that's why it's called the peculiar institution, because of slavery in the antebellum South. And peculiar, as we understand it, means strange and odd. So there's not a one-size-fits-all to this when it comes to CRT. I said that for a roundabout way because there's not a right or wrong answer up here. Our responsibility, and I keep going back to responsibility, is to create an environment where you can think intensively and critically for yourself. I don't think neither one of my colleagues up here came to this panel today to sway you either way, because I didn't. I came here to get you to think about what's going on. How you think is your perspective. And I have to respect that, whether I agree with it or not. It's about respect. But I want to promote critical, the key word that Rachel used, right? Critical, to promote how you use your brain, how we use our brain, how we use our power, how we use our pulpit of influence. It has to be done in a critical way that's intensive in thought, because the critical it is, the more creative it becomes. The more you think about different ways to do things, the more you think about, I didn't know that. And so that's the job of us as academicians. That's our responsibility. That's the purpose of us while we're sitting up here, is to get you to think critically, is to get you to see a different perspective that you may have not seen, or for you to provide us a perspective that we may not have seen. I don't know. That's what the purpose of this discourse is about. It's a two-way street, it's a commerce, an exchange of ideas, and that's what it's all about, guys.
Well said. Thank you so much. Thank you. That's, you know, from that point, I kind of feel like if anyone would like to speak to anything bouncing off of a previous statement or remark or a question that popped into your head that we haven't explored already,
I'll do one.
very happy for that.
So, I have never gone into a classroom and said, I'm going to teach you critical race theory today. That is our topic. This is my PowerPoint. I'm ready to go. Let's do this. I will say that I do teach multiculturally, and I think that I strive to do that in every class. I look at ability. I look at age. I look at race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, and try to bring that into everything that I do teach. I teach primarily composition courses. So we'll do everything. It's mostly about writing, and mostly about letting students choose the things that they want to write about, and not forcing them to be like, this is our curriculum for, I need you to write about, obscure topic of whatever. Trying to think, abortion, okay? I know it's a common, it's an easy one to talk about because it is, there's a lot to talk about with it, but does everyone want to write a 7-page paper on abortion? Not necessarily. And so I guess in thinking about our writing and thinking about what we're doing in classes is to consider that there are other voices to be heard, and not just with race. And that this debate about critical race theory has also brought in discussions about we can't teach LGBTQIA plus curriculum. We can't acknowledge that that's something existing. We can't acknowledge that in the last year and a half there has been there's been hate towards Asian Americans in this country. We can't acknowledge that at the beginning of the COVID pandemic that it was called the Kung Flu, right? And that is that's racism, that's ethnocentrism, and that breeds hate, and that breeds violence against people who have nothing to do with any of that, right? And we can debate the origins of this pandemic and such, And I'm sure we have been for how many months of this, recently. But teaching that there are different perspectives and getting yourselves, and, constantly with myself, multiple perspectives. You're not just listening to one news source, that you are constantly learning, as you are meant to do here as as an institution of learning. And that we all, I think, and this is meant to be just educational, so keep learning. And if this sounds funky to you, critical race theory, go look up some articles. I can give you some recommendations if you'd like. I looked up, there's 4 or 5 articles in front of me of everything from higher education, like Weekly, Education Weekly, to looking at the American Bar Association and what they've said about what critical race theory is. And I hope that if nothing else from today, you go home thinking, I'm gonna look up more about that. That was an interesting concept. I don't know if I agree with everybody, what we have said, and you probably don't, and you shouldn't, honestly. Just because we happen to be teachers of different subjects doesn't mean you should believe every word that we say. That you should go and think for yourself, but you have the tools to do so. And if you don't have the tools to do so, ask. We have a great library. They are so willing to help you. You say basically to Julia Wolvers, I would constantly do this too, I say, I want to talk about this topic. I want to look up some information about, let's say, crime and punishment in literature. She'll be like, all right, let me see what I can find. 3, 4, 5 pages later of information. Oh, look, I found this book for you and this book. Look at all this material. And it's, it's a wealth of knowledge that she's helping me find. And so I hope that with anything, again, learn. Go seek it yourself. If you don't trust us, you shouldn't trust, what is it? You shouldn't trust what they say on TV. My parents always said that to me. And now I tell my parents, you shouldn't trust anything you say on Facebook. It's not necessarily true. Like, Mom, we got to watch the source here. Or that she shouldn't click on the email saying her credit card company card has been hacked. Like, Mom, please do not send me spam, right? Shouldn't believe what the email that you get. You have to research. You have to look at the, simply as most of us technological people, that if it wasn't sent by your credit card company, it's probably not from your credit card company, Ma. But education, so learn. That's all I'll say. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. Anyone else? Oh, Marvin, I'm not sure if you are yes or no.
Everybody's effusive, so that's good. I would just, to meet my objective, I would just say that CRT isn't a perfect view. CRT theorists argue amongst CRT theorists about different parts of the theory. They argue about using race as being the essential core of everyone's element. They argue about nationalism. They argue about not having a theory that you can use scientific methodology for. Other people in CRT argue that, no, we have a science methodology for it. There's arguments within the field in itself. There are problems. I mean, CRT has some problems, and some people might not agree with some of the tenets of CRT. But again, for me, the emphasis is what can people find an agreement on to move the conversation forward. The other thing that I would add quickly, which we don't have time to go into it, is there are some valid concerns in society in general about nothing. Now, we're ready for questions. I don't want to take the time, but like CRT uses terms like whiteness, which they borrowed. They use oppressor and oppressed, which they borrowed. And so what has happened is that because of the George Floyd situation, and then this combination of people wanting to try and make correctives, and then Dr. Kendi's book came out, and then Rahm D'Angelo came out, and then people started grabbing all these concepts. And I'm going to go back again to Dr. Ladson Billings. In 1994, I think she wrote her book, she said, before we do the critical race thing, we need to slow it down and see if you understand this critical race thing. And so I'm thinking that what's happening, where you see some debate, is people are grabbing Robin and Abraham, and they're grabbing them. It's like, oh, whiteness, oh, oppressed, let's throw it in the class. But they're not actually thinking about what it means. So when we talk about moving conversations forward, we have to recognize that when you come at people a particular way without directly understanding what the theory says, right, you're gonna get pushback, and that pushback it's valid. It's a valid pushback, because people don't understand it, because you started grabbing these ideas and just throwing them out there. Like,
Idealism.
it's just, so we, I don't know what equity means. Oh no, we gotta do this. It's like, that's not what it means. But Robin said it. I'm not even gonna talk negatively about her. I didn't read Right Fragility, and I didn't read How to Be Anti-Racist. I don't, those aren't my things. I did read Stamp from the Beginning though. That's a good one. But they're throwing ideas and people are grabbing them and thinking they're doing something, but it's like you're moving, but you're not really moving. And so I think we have to recognize that we need to slow down a little bit. That's all.
Yeah, I love what you said, Marvin, about without even thinking, ... right?
Yeah.
And that's so much of what has been happening, right? In our society, on Facebook, on social media, without even thinking, boom, something comes out, and we start infuriating each other without really good critical thinking. So thank you for clarifying the word critical. I think you all have done an excellent job in explaining what CRT is and is not, and how we as higher educators have that responsibility to help our students. That's what this is for you students, to learn, as Grace's student said, I now know that I am empowered to decide for myself. That is what higher education is about, and I hope each of you students gain that, learn that right up front, and start questioning with critical thinking everything that comes before you. I would like to ask Dr. Bosworth if you might want to wrap us up, summarize us. I'm just curious, with all of the great work and information that you all have just shared, I'm just curious about why there's so much opposition to CRT and what is really behind a lot of that, and how we might be able to help our internal and external constituents. And in doing so, Dr. Bosworth, we may want to open that up to questions from the audience.
I think we can do that now, and we'll probably circle back to that, but we have a little time to let the audience get in if they want to say anything, students, faculty members, Michael, if he wants to say anything. I mean, I think this is the perfect time to open this thing up right there, so let's get with it.
Yes, that was detail-rich. This has been a very enriching discussion, and let us open it up to questions and comments from you, the good people who've turned out today.
You said there's like a responsibility to kind of like use that critical thinking. Do you think that sometimes that responsibility isn't properly done in certain institutions or in certain ways? Because I see sometimes like on the news and stuff, people being like white people being upset that they think it's racist towards white people, and then some people thinking that they're spurring white hatred. Do you think that because certain institutions or certain people who are trying to teach it or trying to talk about it aren't having that critical thought, that's the reasoning for this kind of like extensive hatred and pushback towards it?
Of course, I think with any level of power, as we are sitting in positions of power as instructors and deans and administrators, directors and things of that nature, I think there is a responsibility. We have to be responsible in what we do, and our motives have to be pure to the cause in which we're trying to address. As you said earlier, I have a responsibility to not try to sway you, but say, hey, this is what happened. A, B, C, or D, provide you with the correct and proper information, okay? Not to sway you, but provide you with the information, as Grace said, and let you make the choice. Let you look at the information. Let you get it for yourself, as Annie said earlier. You go find it. I think responsibility can go in a two-way street here, because at the same time, I'm ultimately responsible for what I put out in that classroom, in that academic environment. That's my responsibility, to make sure that you have a just, equitable, diverse, and inclusive environment so you can foster the best educational practices that we can at SCC. And at the same time, you also have a responsibility, as Annie said, not to just take our words for it, to go do some research, to go look it up, to question us, to question everything, to have to go find it. And so, but yes, and going back to what you said earlier, just to circle back to that, there are people that use that to their advantage to promote their own agenda. And that's unfortunate in higher education, that we have agendas, that we have people who are who are there to promote a political agenda, a racist ideology, a xenophobic ideology, a sexist ideology, and not keeping with topic of what's important, and that's about being responsible to being responsible to the truth. And I think I told Rachel this yesterday. We had a conversation, and what did I tell you, Rachel? I said the truth doesn't need crutches. It can stand alone. And so when I'm talking about this right here, whether you agree with it or not, whether you disagree with it or not, it can stand alone because these things happened. This is not nothing that Bosworth is making up. This is not Bosworth's agenda. I can go and show you historical data, context of things that have happened to people in this country, around the world. This is not my personal view, and I try to keep all personal things out of it and just teach from a holistic perspective of knowledge, so you guys can be able to get the information, disseminate that information amongst what's in your cortexes, and understand what that information is and how to best process it. So, but yeah, the responsibility, it goes both ways, but at the same time, I think the professors and the instructors have a greater responsibility to make sure that they're being fair, they're being just, and they're being, open-minded when it comes to those different ideas of expression in the classroom. Hope I answered your question.
I just want to say first, thank you for having this discussion. I guess for me, my concern with the whole the discourse around this and the pushback, especially if you look at videos that go viral of certain school board meetings and things like that. My concern is, as an Asian American myself personally, Shang-Chi was great, by the way, but and I'm concerned that, history that is relevant to me in this country, things that happen to people like me, in the legislation that we see being introduced, that there will be silenced, certain things won't be able to be taught, and people like myself won't be able to, and other people who are not part of my, community won't be able to hear about the experiences of my community in this country, like, things like the Chinese Exclusion Act. You talked about COVID recently, and I'm sure other groups have the same concerns. And like, I know growing up, it sucked because I love history, and I was reading world history books, US history books that have very little to represent me. Like, literally, world history was basically all about Western Europe and like a few pages on Africa.
At the end, right? That you never got to
a
in
few
class.
pages
Your
on
history
Africa
book.
and a few.
I can't tell you how many times I learned about the
Right.
first
A
like
few
100
pages
years
on-
of history, and then look, here's Vietnam, World War II, World War I, everything. I'm like, let's do that in a week. Okay.
And like a few pages on Asia, and like I'm Korean myself, and it was frustrating to see, like, as far as a Korean, like, we only got mentioned at the Korean War. That was like the first thing you heard about us, as if we didn't exist for thousands of years. And
Or didn't exist on American at all, right? Like,
yeah.
Koreans, look, they just came over in the 60s, not like 1840s when the gold rush happened in California, right?
Yeah, and I think it's just have those voices and just the raw history taught. It helps us to appreciate the diversity of our country. And one thing that I am happy about, recently I know Illinois passed that Asian American history is part of their curriculum, and I hope similar things happen in other state legislatures. But after that, my question is, I guess, you're educators and you've also been students. What do you think is a student's, the student body's, I guess, responsibility or role in the whole discussion about not just critical race theory, but just being culturally relevant and making things more inclusive?
What is the role of students or
Students, specifically.
Yes. The role of students, honestly, sharing your story, right? It's, I grew up I was born in Japan and came here when I was 5. Had to learn English at the age of 5 in a kindergarten, which was all English-speaking kids. My mother, I was on the phone with customer service representatives as early as age 8, right? I remember being my mother. Hi, my name is Junko Thomas, and I was talking about myself in the third person. Yeah, Annie has an appointment with the doctor today. It was very odd pretending to be my mother. So I know all of our social security numbers because you had to like rattle them off to pretend like you know what you're talking about, right? And my job as this person, as my mother. And so it's telling my friends, they would see that I'm eating rice for breakfast, right? And like, that's pretty normal. Like, it's not weird to me. I'm eating my rice with my sprinkles. And the fact that I say sprinkles, right? Not candy sprinkles. I have my, seaweed and such. and sharing the food. I remember that was one way that I got my classmates to appreciate some of Japanese culture. Sharing food, sharing candy. Not like the good stuff, like my soy sauce crackers or shrimp chips that they probably would not like at all. Sometimes the smell could be overwhelming, I get it. So it's like the little things that like, oh, look at this cute little candy. Or like, Hello Kitty, yeah, we all like it, yeah. Let's talk Pokemon, let's talk all the kind of things. And so most of that, I believe, is me being willing to share and being like, hey, I'm Asian. And like making sure, hey, did you know that? And I'm sure I've mentioned it a few times, but did you know that that's where I'm from? This is, my identity. Or being, being a woman. Be like, oh, would you like a woman's perspective when we're talking about this white American history, male American history? Sure, right? Yeah. Taking that voice. And I know it's putting a lot of pressure on myself as an Asian American person, but it's where else would our voices get out, right? Being people of color, being, minority in any way. At this school, I believe 4%.
Where, at our school?
Yes,
No,
Asian
no.
Americans.
Oh,
the
Asians?
mixed
Oh,
race.
yes, I'm sorry, yes.
And mixed race people are even a smaller percentage, which I'm also mixed race. That you can't identify with just one or the other, but asking, be like, hey, so we've talked about kind of white history, we've talked about African American history, what about everybody in between? And making that kind of a point to say, hey, could we maybe talk about this? A lot of times with middle school, grade school, high school, there's not a lot of room in the curriculum to add, right? But joining the student groups, we have great student groups. Is it OMSI? Is it called
Yes,
OMSI?
I was just going to give a plug.
You're welcome. And then we
Join
have
the Multicultural Student Association. By multicultural, it's everyone's included, right? Everyone's welcome, and it's about getting to know and understand one another. So sharing your story and getting engaged and sharing your story with others and learning other people's stories as well, other students' stories.
and demanding that you get to learn other stories if you don't already know. Or asking your instructors who, we all know, we have a wealth of knowledge about all sorts of things, but perhaps we are limited in a semester to talk about a certain topic. So asking your English teacher. So you were talking about this topic, and I was really interested, are there any suggestions? You know how many times, I can give you suggestions all day. You say like, I like this book, or you could tell me, I'm more interested in this topic. Oh, let's say you like Toni Morrison. I'm like, oh, let me give you 5 authors. And I'll probably just like start handing you books like, oh, you should read this and read this and read that. Asking and using Google. I love Google for everything. Just finding more information. I love learning, right? And as students, I hope that that's what you want to do. And I don't think I've ever stopped being a student, honestly, is that you're constantly learning. And asking questions when you can and when you feel brave enough, or sending a quiet email to an instructor when you're not comfortable with something that may have been said, or an angle that they didn't get to maybe. Be like, well, you did not, there is a whole other side of this argument that you did not approach. Maybe asking the instructor privately, could you perhaps shed light on that next class, right? It's a hard thing to do, and I encourage you to do it. I'm right behind you, help you do it, but it's demanding the right for your story to be told, and for stories, or being an advocate, an ally, a good way to say, an ally for stories that you know are unheard of. So, long, convoluted answer for that. Sorry.
We've got a couple of questions. We've got some time left. We've got one in back, and then I saw the one in front, so I'm going to go in that order.
I understand that, sorry, I'm trying to convey myself. Basically, my question is, like, you have K, like younger kids and all that with the K learning. How do you decide, like, what to talk about or what topics to discuss with the children, more or less, you know, all that stuff, I guess. The in-depth questions, I guess.
So your question again, you said, how do we decide what to
teach the K students what topics to discuss, and more or less, well, I understand that you can't talk about like the real big stuff, but how do you,
Are you
how
asking how to introduce the ideas?
yes, and how does that,
How young?
yeah, all that
wish we had
stuff.
Nicole here for that. Yeah, Grace, you want to take that one, because I have an idea, but I think this is very delicate
Marvin,
right
child
here.
psychologist, wants to take it.
Okay, go ahead, Marvin.
Yeah,
Take
maybe.
it.
That's an interesting question. Typically, when you want to introduce, this is complicated. Okay, so away from a CRT perspective, what you do find is that for minoritized, the population in America, whether it's African American, Hispanic American, they introduce race to their children relatively early, ages 1 to 2 years old, introducing books with different characters in them, 3 or 4 years old. And so that can map to when someone who's white would introduce concepts of racism to their particular child. There's actually an organization called We Children? We Read, which is actually part of the bill that is supposed to make We Read illegal as a curriculum item, but that's a story for another day. We Read, they actually have, well, you can join, and they will actually provide book kits that help people talk about race. I think it's probably on the ban list because they mentioned that they try and talk to white families about equity, and right now that's all that's required to be on this list, and I'm not actually making this up. But you can introduce it as early as 2 or 3. Anytime you introduce any book to a child, 2 to 3, you can introduce the concept, because the children by 4 are going to start. We see it already. There's no debate in research. There's none. They have racial categories before 4. They identify prejudices by 5. It's without doubt. So now, I'm not saying, and there's the concept of like, do you introduce whiteness and oppression? Probably not at 4 or 5. However, we do know that in black children, they introduce the concepts of blackness at that age. But the problem, of course, with whiteness goes back to Dr. Janet Helms, who identified a white racial identity scale in 1989, is that sometimes people aren't quite sure what a white identity looks like. But her perspective is more positive. But to make it short, whenever you start introducing books to children, you can introduce concepts related to race or skin color to children. And it could be such a simple, it could be a situation where, oh, their skin color is different. I know, isn't it great? We're all different. It doesn't have to then lead to, let me tell you about racism. It doesn't have to be that part. It's like, we're all different. And then you can build from there. But they see it. There's no child psychologist, regardless of political ideology, that says that children don't recognize categories for racial separation or segregation at 4 or 5. It's the science.
Can I speak on this for a second? Because
Sure.
I'm actually going through that right now, because I have twin boys who are 6 and a daughter who's 3. And I'm, trying to be conscious of what's age appropriate and how to talk to them. And so sort of my approach has been to not lie, like try to find books. Like, for example, they were assigned in their social studies curriculum, George Washington. I was like, okay, I'm going to talk about George Washington, but I'm going to make sure I buy them a book that talks about the fact that George Washington had slaves. And it's not saying that George Washington, beat his slaves or did terrible things to them, because they're not ready for that part of slavery yet. But I'm making sure that it's included. I tried to balance out the fact that they were only learning about men, because the curriculum chose George Washington Carver, which is awesome. I love George Washington Carver. But also 2 men now, there's no women. So I made sure that I got child age appropriate books. Like I chose Ruby Bridges because she was 6 years old at the same age as my kids. And she's still alive. Like you can watch videos of her. So I think that there are ways to be open. It also really helps if you're yourself friends with people who look different than you, because that exposure is going to make it normal and easier to look at cultural differences without it being something foreign. So, I mean, that's my advice as a parent. I don't know yet if I fully figured it out. Like, I read a book about Martin Luther King Jr. to my kids on Martin Luther King Day, and it was told from him as a little boy's perspective. And they were talking about how when he was a child, one of his white friends, when he reached a certain age, his white parent told him he couldn't play with Martin Luther King as a boy anymore. And I said it was because, someone was like, well, why did they do that? And I'm like, it's because he was black. They're like, it's because he had black hair? It's like, it was really hard for them to understand. So then I was like, oh God, I don't want to destroy this child's spirit, but how can I explain it? It is a challenging thing to do, but important, so important. Particularly because I think in St. Louis, we are so segregated just because of the way that the systems have worked with subdivisions and school districts, and maybe those are some long-term effects of like the failures of legislative changes to racism. It's important to be proactive, I think, in introducing those ideas, and school becomes one of the places where they can get that exposure. It probably is one of the more important places to get that exposure.
And just to add on to that story, thank you, Grace. Just to add on to what Marvin was saying, I think it may be generational in a sense when you can do that, and I'm gonna explain why. When I was born right after the Civil Rights Movement and in the cusp of the Black Power movement. So I was born in the 70s, and so it was always front and center in my house. It was always front and center that, hey, this is what it is. After what my parents went through during the 1960s, as Rachel so eloquently said about trauma, and I think, you know, being a 70s kid raised by people who experienced that kind of overt, brutal trauma in Louisiana, it shaped me. And so me having 4 boys, they were sort of shielded from that, okay? Sort of, they were, you know, being a historian, being this person here, they were sort of shielded from it. You know, each one of them are different. Each one, from the oldest to the youngest, they're completely different. And the youngest one seems to be the more radical one of the group. You know, he's more like, I'm not gonna say who he's like, but he's the more radical one of the group. And he sees things he's always out there, we have to get this right. That's him. We gotta do this. Dad, we gotta do this, we gotta do that. Let's go, that's him. Oldest one, he's like, whatever. The one after that is like, well, what do you want to do? You know, then my third one, he's like, you know, we gotta, you know, he goes with the flow as well too. So I understand what you're saying when it's introduced. I was introduced to it at a very early age because of circumstances of what just had happened. You know, we still had, in Louisiana, you still had a strong contingent of the KKK. You had various racial uprisings that may not get publicized or talked about that were still going on in the early 70s. And so therefore, how I was raised as a person of color with people who had just experienced this trauma, you know, they were there when Martin Luther King, they were alive when MLK got shot, they were alive when Malcolm X got killed, Medgar Evers, the 16th Street bombing, you know, they were alive, so they lived through that trauma. And so that trauma sort of came down through me, as Grace said, PTSD. And so I was raised that way, very aware of where I was, and I had to live, as Du Bois says, with a double consciousness, okay? You know, look that up, guys, you don't know what that means, double consciousness. And so I understood what it means, and I understood the value of that. And so when I introduced it to my kids, it wasn't as early as I was, because but they weren't introduced to it. And I think it's, for school systems, that's kind of tough. As Marvin said, you know, certain cultures introduce it to them at different stages. And I think, and it depends on what's going on at a particular point in time. And I use me for an example. I know what was front and center in my mind because of what happened to my parents during the Civil Rights Movement of the 60s. So, and that directly affected me and how they raised me and how I was introduced to race. So, hope that answers your question. Some of them.
I just want to ask you guys for some advice. So, growing up, I feel like as a person of color, I've always had like an identity crisis, like feeling like my opinion or my culture has always been silenced and invalidated by teachers, by students around me. So, what I want to ask you guys is, how can you try to avoid that? Because growing up, I always felt like I needed validation from all the non-students of color, I guess, in my classrooms, and I always had to ask them for validation and kind of let my culture not be a part of me, because that's all people just grew up seeing me. So in high school, people, instead of saying, oh, hi, how are you, how's your day? People would be like, so in your religion, do you do this or do you do that? Like, because legally, technically, Middle Easterns and North Africans are white, but by just looking at me, you can tell I'm not white. So I feel like people can just automatically be like, you're making me uncomfortable, stop talking about this. So then it just makes me feel like, oh, my culture's not important, my religion's not important. So growing up, it just gives people who are younger an identity crisis, and it just gives you kind of that thought that, oh, you know what, my opinion's not important right now. My identity is not important right now. My religion is not important right now. So what advice would you guys give as instructors to students who are still, could be going through that right now, because it's still happening as we speak?
Don't feel alone. I know this can be an intimidating place for a minority, and but there are resources, there are people that you can talk to. Be yourself. That's number one. Be who you're going to be. Be proud of yourself. I'm very proud of who I am, and I'm not changing that for anyone. Understand that who you are is very important, very valuable. You will be a great contributor to SCC, the college campus, community, and that's that. And you don't have to prove yourself to anyone. You have to prove yourself to yourself. That's who you have to prove yourself to, because it's never going to be good enough, okay? It's never going to be good enough for certain people anyway, because people already come, some people already come with prejudicial innuendos, misguided statements about race, about ethnicity and things of that nature. So the earlier you deliver yourself from that, because that can keep you down, that can keep you bonded down. I encourage you to be yourself. I encourage you to be free, to live in your spirit of who you are as a person, as an individual, as a female. Be strong, be fierce, and be courageous, because it's a lot of courage to go somewhere where you're different, to stand out, because you do stand out. We stand out, but we're here to make a difference, and that's what you're here for, and this is a great place to be. If I didn't feel so, I wouldn't be here. I love it so far. I'm looking forward to more of these conversations. I'm looking forward to having conversations with people like you. I don't know if anyone else wants to say anything, Annie or Marvin, but I would just tell you to be yourself and be strong in who you are, and be fierce, be courageous, be independent, and just be you. Just remember to be you, and that's who you are. That's your identity, is yourself.
Hi, so I have a question. So in this process, like as a result of CRT, we've discovered a lot. There's still so much more that we don't know. This is all pretty recent, just whole conversation of discovering, like, you know, new and often shocking perspectives and realities for people. My question is, oftentimes when we hear about these things, for like people who are not black, or when we're having these conversations, there's this kind of guilt as a reaction to it, and I don't really find that it is progressive or effective. How would you guys suggest, and I don't think that you guys really, because this is also new, that there is really like a set solution to this, but how do you guys suggest that we implement the teachings of CRT into like a progressive approach rather than this sympathetic one that doesn't really offer any change?
The thing that I think of first is that being Japanese, I have to contend with, and I remember learning about this as a young child, that Pearl Harbor, and that it was my people that did this. Blame, right? That how much have you heard about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? The non-military people who died, and birth defects and all of that, and, you know, devastation of two cities. But feeling the guilt of Pearl Harbor as a Japanese American person, I grew up on a military, or I was born on a military base. I don't know if it can be any more American than I was born on a Tokyo or Yokota Air Force Base, Japan. So military father, right? Moved here when I was 5, lived on the military base, right? But feeling that guilt as a Japanese American, it took me a long time to kind of say, and my mom said it the best way, I think, is she said that there were a lot of bad people who made bad decisions at that time. There were lots of world conflicts, and that you have to look at it then. We were, you know, she wasn't alive. My grandmother wasn't even alive at the time that the bombings happened. But it's, can I feel guilt for my entire country, entire in some ways, I can acknowledge it and I won't deny what happened. And I will say, yes, there were some bad things. There was, thinking about what happened to China at the hands of the Japanese. I can acknowledge that there's a history there. I can acknowledge that in American history, there are some things that I should not be proud of. Do I feel guilty personally? Perhaps not, but I can also empathize and sympathize and learn. And what is the kind of point of history but to not repeat it, right? And feeling that you can't be, the guilt is a quick reaction, right? It's something that you feel immediately and you feel defensive. You don't want to be wrong. You don't want to be the person to blame. But what happens after, right? What can we do after to kind of be like, okay, I don't feel great about this. Why don't I feel great about this? I'm not a politician. I didn't make the decisions. So how can we kind of go forward from there? And I think the solution is to be like, I feel uncomfortable with this. Why? And ask that and have people explore it. And it kind of comes back to education. You can tell I'm a teacher, right? It's all about the learning. And I don't know if the rest of you, but that was the one thing that popped into my mind, is that there is a sense of guilt, but there is also a sense of what can I do about it after? Yeah. And how can we move forward as a society who has these issues, who's had this terrible history, to not do it again, or to actually be inclusive afterwards, right?
Yeah. I thought I might say really quick too, been a little quieter on these because I don't feel, as my position as a white woman here, that I can answer a lot of these questions. But this one, I think there is a guilt, to be sure, felt on the white side. And I think about, as a child, my grandmother was an immigrant from Germany. So I remember being in elementary school at some point learning that I both was on the wrong side of history twice in my heritage, right? It was like Nazis and the Civil War, like what is wrong here? I even, this is really sort of odd, but lied that I was from Wilcox County, which if you look it up, pretty sure is the token county from the state of Alabama that seceded from the state when it seceded from the Union. Like I wanted to be a part of
the good people.
I
right?
did.
Yeah.
I think I was 8 or 9. So this, I know I don't mean to infantilize this. Like this is something that I remember feeling, and I think it's absolutely what you're saying, Annie, depending on the context for sure, but how you work through that, because again, I think that's part of this trauma model that we've talked about, right? That there are very human feelings in reaction to this. And certainly to remember that when we're talking about things like racism and we use words like systemic, Merriam-Webster added that to the definition of racism just in this past year, that racism, like that systemic model. So instead of saying we're not necessarily pointing at you individual to bear the weight of this inheritance, but it does feel that way sometimes. And how you use that, how you work through it, that is a really important question. I don't have neat answers, but I think it's powerful that you're even thinking about that. But not resting there. That's the main thing. Not being, sort of wallowing in complacency. That's where I think it can really be a waste.
We've gone 95 minutes. This is the longest of our sessions so far with Democracy Days 2021. Let's have one more question and then a wrap.
First off, thank you guys for all being here. So how, as students, can we help bring awareness to CRT outside of the classroom and outside of discussions like this? Because honestly, I didn't even know this was a thing before my professor's hey, go to this for extra credit. And I'm like, I don't even know what this is. Cool. So then I researched it and I was like, oh, okay, I guess this is a real issue that's going on. So I didn't even know this was a thing. So how can we help raise awareness to this just in public?
Can I take that one?
Go for it.
I would love to take that one. So this is what we're striving for, is for more and more of our students like you to become involved in learning more about people who are different than themselves, right? So I'll go back to the Multicultural Student Association. It's a new student club, student-led club that is getting off the ground. If you're interested, let me know, or our new manager of Multicultural, the Office of Multicultural Student Engagement. His name is Chris Cross. That's an easier name to remember than mine. So Chris Cross, he's over in the College Center, and his primary focus is to include as many students as possible into experiences where you can have these type of conversations and whatever conversations you'd like to have to get to know fellow students, right? And beyond the, you know, tell me about your religion, get to know each other as people, as individuals, and where we can share. Because personally, my belief as your diversity officer here and my belief as a person is that it's when we gain some understanding of another person that we learn more about ourselves. And I think that's what the college experience really is about, and that's what we want to make absolutely a welcoming, inclusive campus where we can all just have interesting, engaging, critically thinking conversations to get to know each other better. So come and talk to me, find Crisscross, anybody else that you, I mean, anybody that's on this panel, and we'll point you into different ideas.
I will add quickly that it's a, you know, I'm sure you have a friend group, my goodness, and just like, did you know about this thing called critical race theory? Like, I went to this panel, you can talk about some of the ideas maybe, or like you look up it on your own, but like, if they don't, you know, chances are your friends don't know about it either, right? It's something that may not be talked about, so it could be just bringing it up in conversation. Do you guys know much about this? Like, is this a thing? I know, you know, I don't expect you to go make like a TikTok video, it'd be cool, but think, you know, talk about it. Be like, okay, what's this thing? It was kind of weird. These people just talked a lot, and like, what were they talking about? And it's, I guess, just bringing it up in conversation and not letting it just kind of stay here, right, in this session. And it's, I think, bringing awareness to just what it is, and joining groups, you know, all of that is all great. Going to more sessions like this, that you're interested in something like this, and you see something, another thing about race, or nothing about cultural, you know, cultural identities or culture in general, and you go to it, right? You learn.
And we are wanting to do more and more of those type of activities, and it'll take students like you to help make that happen, okay?
I need to add something real quick. First off, I wouldn't share CRT with anyone unless I've read it, so I would suggest reading the Essential Readers of Delgado if you're going to go that path. Just to be honest, everybody up here doesn't teach CRT, so you want to read the Essential Primer, and then if you have time on YouTube, if you go to, Brittany King has a YouTube channel. It's like Shade with Brittany King, and there's a debate on there. And they have that are against CRT and three that are for CRT and 4 that are against. On that particular debate, you'll see a person by the name of Eric Smith who's against it. He's a professor. He talks about it a little bit in detail. And there's a philosopher by the name of Sam Hoadley-Brill who's for CRT. And they do give some of the pros and cons amongst each other. There are other people, but they're not as studied in it. So I would say that before you share CRT, make sure you read that primer. That YouTube, it's about an hour long, and it's pretty good. And then there are other resources, other philosophers that debate it, but that YouTube is actually more understandable. Sometimes philosophers get out in space. Nothing against the philosophers, but no, when they engage in the topic. So I would, because like, it's good. And OMSI's good, but that's a different thing. That's, you know, getting cultural awareness, cultural diversity, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm CRT because I embrace diversity. And that's another misconception. That's a totally different thing. That's all I would say. That's all. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all so much for hanging in there for this long time. We really appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you.
I got a couple of other people if you want to get their web link real fast.
Great panel, guys.
Yes. I think I need an assignment. Like, I don't teach history overtly, but you can't teach literature without it. So why not just sneak some of that in there?
Yeah.